The overnight shift never truly began. It only thickened, like fog settling into corridors already exhausted by the day. The new nurse signed in without speaking, clipped her badge beneath the pocket seam, and took position beside the trauma supply cart where no one needed her yet. Conversations flowed around her rather than to her. Senior nurses spoke in shorthand she did not interrupt. Residents rehearsed authority they had not earned, and the attending physician dictated orders while walking away from the people meant to hear them. At 2:14, the ambulance bay doors opened and the rhythm changed. Paramedics rolled in a male patient with controlled bleeding but unstable respiration, their report hurried and strangely imprecise. "Found down near the waterfront," one said, avoiding eye contact. "No ID, possible fall." The nurse watched the patient's boots before she looked at his wounds. Heavy tread, still laced tight, not cut away during field treatment. She noticed the bandage placement, pressure applied correctly but not by a civilian responder. The attending barely glanced at her. "New one, get IV access and stay clear." She obeyed, but her hands paused half a second above the tray as she scanned the injury pattern. Shallow lateral graze across the rib margin, deeper puncture near the clavicle, bruising inconsistent with a fall. She inserted the line without comment, adjusting the angle so the patient's arm could move freely if muscle rigidity returned. The monitor alarmed once, sharply, then steadied. "Lucky tonight," a resident muttered. She did not answer. The paramedic report continued to unravel under questions. Location shifted by 2 blocks, timeline shortened by 3 minutes, and neither medic could explain why they had shut off their shoulder radios before arrival. The nurse moved the oxygen mask slightly lower, allowing the patient to breathe easier while appearing unchanged, and quietly repositioned the gurney 6 inches farther from the doorway. No one noticed except the patient, whose eyelids twitched in recognition of movement discipline rather than medical adjustment. Outside the trauma bay, security passed the door twice in 5 minutes, then a third time with a supervisor who spoke softly into his handset. The nurse heard unfamiliar call signs, clipped and structured, not local police cadence. She checked the saline flow, corrected a decimal point on the medication chart the resident had entered too quickly, and taped the line with extra slack to prevent accidental removal during transport. "You've done trauma before?" the older nurse asked absently while preparing sutures. "Some," she replied, voice neutral. The attending ordered imaging but hesitated at the patient's clothing bag. The pockets were empty except for a torn seam where something had been deliberately removed. The patient's pulse spiked briefly when overhead speakers announced an incoming helicopter landing at another hospital miles away, a reaction too precise for coincidence. She reduced the room noise by lowering a metal tray onto rubber padding rather than stainless steel, and his vitals eased again. Outside, sirens passed without stopping, yet the ambulance bay camera feed froze for 4 seconds on the wall monitor before resuming. No one else looked up. She did, memorizing the timestamp. The resident attempted to insert a second line and failed twice, growing impatient, and she gently guided his wrist a centimeter inward without explanation. The catheter seated immediately. "Good," he said, assuming success. The patient's breathing worsened in a pattern she recognized, anticipatory, not purely physiological, and she adjusted the curtain angle to narrow his field of view toward the staff instead of the hallway. The older nurse frowned. "Why that?" "Less stimulation," she answered, which was true enough. Administration called down asking why security logs showed increased activity near trauma intake. The attending dismissed it as routine. Moments later, 2 plainclothes officers entered the waiting area but did not approach the desk. They watched exits instead. The new nurse recorded vitals precisely every minute instead of every 3, charting quietly while others debated imaging priority. The patient attempted to speak once, barely audible. She leaned closer but did not respond verbally, only pressed 2 fingers lightly against the mattress rail in a steady rhythm. His shoulders relaxed. When transport finally arrived, she insisted the portable monitor be secured to the left side rather than the right, preventing the hallway corner from blocking view during movement. The orderly shrugged and complied. As they wheeled out, the hallway felt narrower, conversations shorter, footsteps heavier. Through the glass doors, she saw more vehicles outside than a normal night would justify, parked without emergency lights yet arranged with intent. No announcement had been made. Inside the chart, she corrected one final detail: mechanism of injury listed as unknown, not accidental. Then she returned to the supply cart and waited, as if nothing had begun at all. The first sign the hospital understood something was wrong came not from a siren, but from silence in the parking lot. At 3:02, the automatic doors opened and did not close again because someone outside held the sensor deliberately, long enough for cold air to move through the lobby and carry the sound of synchronized movement. Security radios began speaking over one another, then abruptly stopped as if instructed to listen instead. The new nurse was restocking gauze when the charge nurse received a call and stiffened mid-sentence, her tone shifting from routine irritation to careful compliance. Yes. Yes. Administration is aware. No, we have not moved the patient. The overhead board flickered and locked several elevators at once. No announcement followed. In the trauma imaging corridor, the patient's monitor registered a small elevation in pulse. Not panic, recognition. The nurse adjusted the blanket edge to keep his hands covered and checked the hallway sightline through the reflection of the IV pump rather than turning her head. 3 individuals in plain clothes entered the restricted wing, escorted by a hospital administrator who kept speaking too quickly about liability policies. Their posture did not match visitors or police. They walked as if memorizing corners. The administrator demanded chart access and was refused by the attending. Voices rising under fluorescent light, policy against authority neither side fully understood. The nurse spoke only once, suggesting the imaging suite be cleared for equipment calibration to reduce hallway traffic, phrased as a courtesy to radiology. The charge nurse approved it without question, grateful for a practical solution. Foot traffic thinned, creating distance between the patient and the waiting area where more unfamiliar figures now sat without signing in. One of the plainclothes officers lifted a confiscated handheld radio from a sealed evidence bag and spoke a phrase into it that the room did not recognize. The nurse's pen paused over the chart for half a second before she continued writing, correcting the oxygen saturation alarm limit to prevent unnecessary alerts during movement. The patient attempted to turn his head toward the sound, but she stabilized the cervical collar slightly tighter than medically required, a protective restraint disguised as protocol. A security supervisor entered requesting relocation of the patient to a more visible room. She gently countered that line of sight from the nurse's station would expose sterile equipment during transport and suggested the opposite placement, deeper in the wing, appearing protective of infection control. The attending accepted the reasoning. Outside the glass corridor doors, 2 uniformed local officers spoke with men who did not show badges yet controlled the conversation. Administration demanded identification and received only a phone call placed directly to the hospital director, after which resistance stopped. The nurse began preparing an additional saline bag and hung it without connecting the line, staging rather than treating. When a resident asked why, she answered, "In case pressure drops during scan transfer," and he nodded, relieved someone had planned ahead. A faint coded exchange came through the recovered radio, numbers followed by directional references inconsistent with city streets. She altered the patient's bed angle 5 degrees toward the wall, preventing clear view from the hallway glass while preserving respiratory expansion. The patient's breathing steadied again. Moments later, the power in the waiting television cut briefly, and through the reflection, she counted at least 8 more figures taking positions at entrances rather than reception. The hospital was not being searched. It was being contained. The administrator returned, voice tight, announcing a temporary lockdown due to an external law enforcement request. Panic tried to form among families, but the nurse dimmed the trauma bay lights under the pretense of improving imaging readability, lowering agitation before it spread. The attending questioned the necessity of such measures and demanded explanations. None came. Instead, a senior officer approached the trauma threshold and asked who had triaged the patient. Several staff gestured loosely at each other until the charge nurse indicated the new nurse had placed the first line. The officer looked at her only briefly before scanning the room again, yet his questions changed tone, more precise, referencing time windows rather than symptoms. She answered minimally and returned to charting. Another coded transmission crackled from the radio, this time mentioning a perimeter narrowing. She moved the crash cart 2 feet closer to the bed and unlocked the defibrillator paddles, not for cardiac risk, but for immediate readiness of a portable power source should monitors need relocation. The resident misread her action as caution and thanked her. The patient's eyes opened slightly, tracking the ceiling corners as if mapping exits he could not reach. She adjusted the curtain seam once more, shielding him from the doorway where silhouettes passed at measured intervals. Administration attempted again to assert privacy law and was told quietly that public safety orders superseded internal policy. The argument ended without victory. The nurse requested additional bandage stock from Central Supply, intentionally depleting visible inventory so fewer people would enter the corridor unannounced. Minutes stretched heavier than hours. Outside, vehicle engines remained running but unseen. Inside, the hierarchy thinned, decisions deferred to whoever sounded most certain. She never raised her voice, yet tasks began routing through her suggestions. Where to stand, when to move, which alarms to silence. Not authority declared, but authority followed. When the elevator at the end of the hall opened and no one stepped out, every person in the trauma wing felt the same realization at once. The hospital was now part of something larger than medicine. She checked the patient's pupils, steady and aware, and spoke the first unnecessary words of the night, barely audible. Stay with the routine. His pulse slowed as if understanding instruction rather than reassurance. Footsteps approached in disciplined cadence toward the restricted door, and the charge nurse whispered that a federal team was requesting immediate access to the patient's room. The attending prepared to refuse again. The new nurse capped the unused saline line, secured the bed breaks, and stepped half a pace back from the gurney, placing herself where she could see both entrance and patient without appearing to choose either. The handle turned. The door opened only halfway before stopping against a restraint placed there earlier to protect equipment clearance, forcing the first man through to turn his shoulders as he entered, slowing momentum and widening the room's awareness of him. He carried no visible rank, yet every other figure behind him deferred half a step, their spacing deliberate, sight lines overlapping. The attending began speaking immediately about consent and jurisdiction, but the man's attention moved past him to the patient, then to the equipment positions, then finally to the nurse who had stepped aside yet remained within reach of the monitor panel. He said nothing to her. Instead, he asked for a status update using terminology closer to a field brief than a medical report. The resident faltered, translating physiology into explanation until the nurse quietly listed the vitals in concise intervals without interpretation. The man nodded once and shifted his weight as if confirming a map only he could see. A second officer approached the hallway window and froze. Down the corridor, a figure had appeared near the emergency exit, posture wrong for a visitor, gaze fixed too long on the restricted wing. Security hesitated, uncertain whether to confront or wait for instruction, and the moment stretched toward panic. The nurse pressed the overhead call button twice in quick succession, not long enough to trigger alarm, but enough to cue a maintenance code rarely used at night. Lights in the adjacent corridor dimmed automatically to energy-saving mode, narrowing visibility and forcing silhouettes into contrast. Power fluctuation, she said calmly when questioned, already repositioning the patient bed 10 degrees to align with the interior wall. The plainclothes officer by the door heard the cadence of her voice and glanced at her again, longer this time. The suspicious figure moved closer to the wing, and a family member in the waiting area stood to protest the lockdown, drawing attention exactly where it should not be. Rather than escalate, the nurse stepped into the hall carrying a tray as if transporting samples, crossing the sight line and breaking the stranger's visual lock on the trauma room. He adjusted instinctively to follow her movement, exposing his hands and confirming the tension in his posture. Security approached under the pretense of redirecting him, and the officers shifted positions without running, closing angles instead of distance. Inside the room, the patient's breathing accelerated. The nurse returned and reduced the monitor volume before alarms could sharpen the air. The attending demanded explanation for the dimmed corridor, and she replied with routine maintenance protocol, already checking the cervical collar while her eyes flicked once toward the doorway. A sudden metallic impact sounded from farther down the hall where another door had been forced against its magnet lock, and staff began speaking over one another. She raised a single hand without looking at them and said, "Keep voices low for the patient," and they obeyed without realizing why. The lead officer spoke quietly into a shoulder mic, then to her, asking who initiated the lighting change. "Facilities automation," she answered, neither claiming nor denying, but his gaze held steady as if weighing precision rather than words. Another crash echoed closer now, and the patient attempted to sit upright despite injury. She placed a firm palm on his shoulder, not restraining, anchoring, and he stilled. The team in the hallway converged with controlled speed, and a brief struggle ended in muffled commands instead of gunfire. No one inside saw it, only heard the shift from tension to containment. She resumed charting as if nothing unusual had occurred, documenting respiration intervals with exact timestamps. The officer near the monitor noticed the pattern matched the cadence of the hallway movements seconds earlier and looked to her once more, understanding beginning without confirmation. The attending tried to reclaim control, issuing orders louder than needed, but staff now watched her before acting, waiting for the subtle nod that followed each instruction. She adjusted the IV flow fractionally to compensate for the patient's earlier movement, then asked for fresh dressings before bleeding could increase, predicting rather than reacting. When additional personnel entered to secure the wing, they paused at the threshold, instinctively leaving her working space untouched. No introduction was made, no authority declared, yet the room organized around her decisions. The lead officer finally spoke a single question under the noise of equipment, using a title that could have been coincidence, but was not. She did not answer, only tightened the bandage and said the patient was stable for now. That was enough. He stepped back and began issuing commands to his team with quiet certainty, mirroring her restraint. Outside, the corridor returned to stillness, and inside the trauma bay, every person felt the balance shift even though no one had been told why. He waited until the room settled into the narrow quiet that follows controlled movement before speaking to her again, not across the bed, but beside the supply counter where conversations could exist without witnesses hearing meaning. The others focused on the patient, on sutures and numbers, and the relief of routine returning, while the man addressed her with a formal designation spoken low enough to pass as a name. She did not look up immediately, finishing the tape seal along the dressing so it would hold during transport, then met his eyes only long enough to confirm recognition. "You were not scheduled to remain embedded," he said, voice even. "Extraction window is active." She checked the saline level before answering. "Negative. Patient transport risk exceeds threshold." He studied the chart in her hand and the steadiness of her breathing rather than her words. Down the corridor, his team secured the detained suspect. The radio updates were concise, perimeter holding, secondary search ongoing. "Command requires continuity," he continued, meaning the operation, the chain above him. the expectations waiting outside the hospital walls. She adjusted the patient's blanket again, shielding exposed skin from the cold air of an open door. "Continuity includes survival," she replied quietly. The patient stirred, pain cresting despite medication, and she prepared an additional dose calculated just beneath respiratory compromise. The attending questioned the timing, and she provided clinical justification without revealing urgency, maintaining the boundary between roles. The man watched her choose medicine over departure and understood the decision had already been made before he arrived. "If he speaks," he said carefully, "we secure a network." She pressed the syringe port and monitored the response. "If he dies," she answered, "there is no network." Silence held between them, heavy but not hostile. Outside, a transport gurney waited for transfer to intensive care, and the hallway remained clear by deliberate design. He informed her the command authority would reassign responsibility upon confirmation. She nodded once, accepting consequence without discussion. A younger officer approached with a sealed evidence pouch recovered from the suspect, requesting direction from him. Yet his gaze remained on her a moment longer before he gave the order himself, adapting to her choice. The patient's pulse stabilized under her hand, fragile but present. She documented the medication under hospital protocol rather than operational notation, leaving no trace of the conversation in official record. "You will be listed absent," he said, almost an apology. "Then list me working," she replied, turning back to the bed. The transport team entered, and she walked beside the gurney through the secured corridor, while the officers held position at intersections, not escorting her but ensuring passage. In the elevator, she maintained focus on oxygen saturation while the man stood opposite, understanding the mission had shifted from capture to preservation by her decision. At intensive care doors, she transferred care to the receiving staff with concise instruction, neither hurried nor delayed, and only after the monitors confirmed stability did she step back. He extended a folded document, authorization for extraction she did not take. "Later," she said, and returned toward the trauma wing where fresh patients now waited, leaving him holding orders that no longer directed the night. Morning entered the hospital without ceremony, pale light flattening the edges of a night no one would formally describe. The lockdown lifted in stages, first the elevators, then the waiting room doors, then the quiet removal of personnel who had never signed the visitor log. By the time the day shift arrived, the corridors looked ordinary again, though conversations stayed careful and brief as if the walls had learned to listen. The new nurse finished wiping down the trauma bed she had used hours earlier, replacing supplies she alone seemed to remember were missing. No supervisor assigned her the task. She completed it because it was unfinished. At the nurse's station, a memo instructed staff to direct all media inquiries to administration and to document the event as a routine security cooperation. No one argued. The attending passed her once and paused, searching for a question that would not expose uncertainty, then settled for a nod he had not given before. She acknowledged it and continued charting. In intensive care, the patient remained alive, sedated, guarded now by uniformed officers whose presence was explained as precaution. She checked his vitals during her rotation like any other case, adjusting a line that had begun to kink and recording the change without annotation. The officer from the night stood at the far end of the hall long enough to see the correction, then left without approaching. At 7:43, she opened her locker and found a sealed folder placed inside, no signature on the envelope, only a transfer notation stamped in small print. She set it back on the shelf and changed out of her gloves first, then washed her hands slowly, completing the shift before reading what she already understood. Around her, the staff spoke in fragments, about the number of vehicles, about jurisdiction, about rumors of an investigation, but none addressed her directly and she offered nothing to invite it. When her replacement arrived, she delivered report in measured sentences focused solely on treatment plans and medication intervals. No mention of the corridor, the lights, or the decisions that had redirected the night. The sun rose fully by the time she stepped through the employee exit. The parking lot held only civilian cars now, spaces where heavier vehicles had idled hours before already empty. She opened the folder beside her car, read the reassignment orders once, and closed it again without expression. A black sedan moved past the entrance at slow speed and continued down the street, not stopping. She placed the envelope on the passenger seat and started the engine, leaving at the same unhurried pace as any exhausted nurse after overtime. Inside the hospital, the shift changed, monitors beeped, and the story reduced itself to paperwork. No announcement followed her departure, and no one used the title the night had nearly spoken aloud.